It began not with a gunshot but with a whisper. In 1942, somewhere in a quiet office in New York, a coded message arrived from Lisbon. Neutral ground, the crossroads of every spy and every lie in Europe. It was short, precise, and dangerous. It claimed, the Americans are preparing a new convoy route across the Atlantic. But the truth was that message was never meant for Berlin. It was written in Washington. The United States, once naive to the art of deception, was learning fast. Until that point, the Germans had believed they owned the shadows, masters of infiltration, manipulation, and subversion. They had sent agents across oceans in submarines hidden among the chaos of war. They believed that in America, a country vast, open, and new to espionage, their network would flourish unseen. They were wrong. What they didn't know was that by the time the first wave of Nazi spies landed on American soil, every move, every word, every secret they carried was already part of a script written by the FBI. The war in the shadows had begun, and in this war the most valuable weapon wasn't the gun or the bomb. It was information. And the men who controlled it could change the course of history without ever firing a shot. When America entered the Second World War after Pearl Harbor, it was still a nation untested in the dark arts of intelligence. Britain had MI5, MI6, and the brilliant deception networks of the double-cross system. Germany had the Abwehr, efficient and ruthless, with agents planted across Europe. But the US? It had the FBI, a law enforcement body, not a spy agency. And in the first months of war, that difference nearly proved fatal. German intelligence, the Abwehr, believed America was vulnerable. Under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, they organized a daring plan: send trained agents to the United States to sabotage key targets. Industrial plants, bridges, rail lines, anything that could slow down the American war machine before it truly started. The plan was codenamed Operation Pastorius. In June 1942, 2 German submarines surfaced off the East Coast. One near Amagansett, New York, the other near Ponte Vedra, Florida. From the black water, 8 men emerged, dressed in civilian clothes, carrying explosives, American cash, and orders straight from Berlin. They were supposed to disappear into the vastness of the United States, blend in, and strike. Instead, within days the entire mission collapsed. Because one of them, George Dash, made a phone call that would change everything. He called the FBI. At first they didn't believe him. A man claiming to be a Nazi saboteur? It sounded like madness. But when he dropped a stack of cash and a list of names on an agent's desk, the truth became undeniable. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, suddenly had in its hands the first major espionage case of the war, and a propaganda opportunity too good to miss. Within weeks, all 8 agents were arrested. 6 were executed. 2, including Dash, were spared, their lives exchanged for their betrayal. The German high command was stunned. They couldn't understand how their agents had been caught so quickly. To them, it looked like impossible efficiency. What they didn't realize was that this single failure would give the United States the key to dismantle their entire spy network. Dash's confession provided something priceless: insight into how the Abwehr trained, how it communicated, and how it thought. For the first time, America had a window into the German mind. From that moment, the FBI shifted from defense to offense. Every captured agent was no longer just a criminal, he was a potential weapon. And in the months that followed, a pattern emerged. New agents sent from Germany kept arriving, each more confident than the last. Each one was caught. But instead of executing them immediately, the FBI made a bold decision. They would feed the Abwehr what it wanted most: intelligence. Except this intelligence would be false. It was the beginning of America's own double-cross system, a mirror to Britain's model, but uniquely American in style, precise, methodical, and quietly ruthless. German agents were turned, kept under watch, and used as conduits for misinformation back to Berlin. The FBI dictated every word they sent. Convoy movements, industrial production, even weather reports, all meticulously crafted to manipulate German strategy. The Abwehr believed they had loyal men reporting from within the United States. In reality, they were listening to Hoover's men the whole time. By 1943, what began as a small counterintelligence effort had become an invisible battlefield stretching from New York to Berlin. Every telegram, every coded letter, every piece of information exchanged across the Atlantic was a move in a silent game of chess. And in that game, the Germans were playing blind. Still, not every victory came without cost. Many of the captured agents, ordinary men convinced by ideology or desperation, believed until their dying breath that they were serving the fatherland. Their reports home were read, approved, even rewritten by their captors. They thought they were winning the war for Germany. In truth, they were helping to lose it. One agent, Eric Gimpel, a radio operator trained by the Abwehr, spent months trying to set up transmission lines back to Europe. He didn't know that every signal he sent was triangulated, every word dissected. By the time he realized, the FBI was already waiting outside his door. Others, like William Kolpaugh, an American defector turned German spy, returned to U.S. soil believing he would walk unnoticed. He didn't last a week. The system was airtight. The FBI's deception program, though less famous than Britain's, became one of the most successful counterintelligence operations in history. Every false message confirmed German biases, reinforced their illusions, and subtly redirected their strategy. While Germany trusted their invisible army in America, the truth was simple: they had none. Every agent had been compromised, controlled, or eliminated. And by 1944, when the tides of war turned in Europe, Berlin still believed its American spies were thriving. They sent congratulations, promotions, even medals, to ghosts. For the men inside the FBI, it was a cold kind of triumph. They had mastered the game of deception, but at a cost to their own humanity. Every intercepted letter, every forged message carried the voice of someone who believed they were serving their nation, someone who would die not knowing the truth. And yet, for the United States, the result was clear. German intelligence had been blinded, outplayed, and ultimately dismantled from within. But as the Allies prepared for the invasion of Europe, a darker question began to rise in Washington. If deception could destroy the enemy's truth, how long before it began to destroy their own? As the Allies prepared for the invasion of Europe, the deception game reached a new and dangerous level. What had begun as isolated acts of counterintelligence on American soil evolved into a coordinated campaign of illusion, one that would shape the entire course of the war. By 1944, deception had become a weapon of mass influence. The Americans had learned from the British masters of disguise, absorbing lessons from MI5's legendary double-cross system. Together, they crafted a mosaic of falsehoods so convincing that even Hitler himself believed it. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, terrifying in its precision: mislead the German high command into believing that the Allied invasion would come not in Normandy, but in Pas-de-Calais, far to the north. Every part of the deception had to be perfect. Every photograph, every radio transmission, every whisper. And in that vast orchestration, the American Counterintelligence Service played a crucial role. They had learned to weaponize trust. Through networks of captured German agents, now completely under their control, the Americans transmitted false intelligence across the Atlantic. The Abwehr received detailed reports of non-existent divisions stationed in England, of fake troop buildups, and phantom generals commanding entire ghost armies. Each report was read in Berlin with satisfaction. Each word pulled the Reich one step further into its own delusion. Behind the scenes in Washington and London, men like William J. Donovan, head of the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, worked in near total secrecy. Donovan, a lawyer turned soldier, believed that intelligence could be as decisive as any battlefield victory. Under his leadership, the OSS developed operations that blurred the line between reality and fiction. They planted forged letters, staged fake movements, and sent counterfeit maps to agents they knew would be caught. They turned human beings into instruments of narrative, crafting a war where perception was more lethal than steel. The Germans never stood a chance. For years, their intelligence structure had been hollowed from within, not by bombs but by belief. Even the Abwehr's head, Admiral Canaris, had begun to doubt his own network. By 1944, he suspected that large parts of his operation had been compromised, but by then it was too late. His attempts to reform or resist were seen as treason, and eventually he would be executed by the very regime he had once served. In America, the success of the deception campaign created a dangerous sense of confidence. The FBI had crushed the Abwehr network at home. The OSS was thriving in Europe. Messages from captured spies continued to pour into Washington, most of them written by American hands but signed with German names. It was a machinery of falsehood running smoothly, efficiently, invisibly. And yet, beneath the victories, there was an unease that no one wanted to acknowledge. The men who ran these operations, agents, handlers, cryptographers, had begun to lose track of the line between real and fabricated intelligence. In some cases, the lies became so elaborate that even their creators couldn't remember what was true. They had become prisoners of their own illusions, mirroring the enemy they deceived. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the Abwehr was collapsing under pressure. The Gestapo had begun purging suspected traitors. Communication channels that once spanned the globe were closing one by one. But to Hitler and his generals, America's deception still looked like chaos, an enemy too big, too divided, too distracted to pose an immediate threat. That illusion, fed by American double agents, gave the Allies the single most valuable advantage in modern warfare: surprise. In June 1944, when the Allies finally stormed the beaches of Normandy, German commanders hesitated. Reports from their own agents in England insisted that the landings were a feint, a diversion before the real attack at Calais. For weeks, German reserves were held in the north, waiting for an assault that would never come. Those false reports, the ones typed in Washington, cabled through neutral Lisbon and read in Berlin, saved thousands of Allied lives. Deception had become destiny. After Normandy, the tide of war was irreversible. But for the men who had lived and breathed deceit, the victory was hollow. The German spy network in America no longer existed. Every known agent had been executed, imprisoned, or turned. Berlin's trust in its own intelligence apparatus was shattered. And in that vacuum of failure, a new truth emerged. Deception, once unleashed, could never be fully contained. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the offices of American counterintelligence were overflowing with secrets. Files of captured communications, coded diaries, names of agents who had never even known they'd been betrayed. Some of those men died believing they were heroes. Others died never knowing they had been tools. George Dash, the man whose betrayal had started it all, was sitting in an American prison cell. His dream of returning home to Germany as a hero had turned to ash. When the war ended, he expected freedom. Instead, he was deported to a country that now saw him not as a patriot but as a traitor. He lived quietly in exile, forgotten by the world he once tried to serve. And yet, his single phone call had rewritten the story of espionage in America. In the post-war years, as Europe rebuilt itself from ruins, the United States began to see the value of what it had created: a vast, invisible architecture of intelligence. The OSS was dissolved, reborn as the Central Intelligence Agency in 1947. Its foundation rested on lessons learned from the war: that information could be manufactured, that truth could be engineered, and that deception, when perfected, could shape the destiny of nations. For Germany, the story ended in humiliation. The Abwehr was gone, its leaders executed or imprisoned, its legacy buried beneath the rubble of Berlin. But for the young men who had served it, men who had crossed oceans believing they were fighting for victory, the end was personal. They had been used, discarded, and erased from history. Their final reports, sent faithfully to Berlin, had been edited by their captors, twisted into weapons that helped destroy their homeland. Their loyalty had been their undoing. And yet, in those final months, something unexpected happened. As the German intelligence system collapsed, the Americans began to inherit its ghosts. Files, agents, contacts, all were absorbed into the machinery of post-war intelligence. The line between victor and vanquished began to blur. The FBI's wartime deception program quietly dissolved, its existence buried in classified archives. But its methods survived, passed on, refined, and globalized. By the dawn of the Cold War, deception was no longer a tactic. It was policy. The War of Shadows had ended in Europe, but in truth, it had only just begun. In the years that followed, both the United States and the Soviet Union would build entire empires on the art of disinformation. Operations that once targeted the Axis would be turned inward, against allies, against civilians, against anyone who needed to believe a version of reality convenient to power. And somewhere in that transformation, between victory and paranoia, the spirit of those first American counterintelligence officers was lost. They had begun as defenders of truth, only to become engineers of illusion. The Germans had lost the war. But the Americans had inherited their methods. For decades, the story of the useless German spies, the men who sent back lies they thought were truths, would remain buried, classified, forgotten. The public saw only the triumph: efficient FBI agents, clever deception, patriotic victory. The moral simplicity of good defeating evil. But history is never that simple. Beneath the clean surface of victory lies the same question that haunted those dark offices in Washington. When a nation learns to deceive its enemies so well, how long before it begins deceiving itself? By the summer of 1946, the world was still trembling from the war that had consumed it. Cities lay in ruins, maps were redrawn, and behind every victory parade, a quieter battle was already beginning. The battle for information, for loyalty, for truth itself. In Washington, the men who had orchestrated America's wartime deception gathered in rooms without windows. They no longer spoke of Germany or Japan. Their new concern was a different kind of enemy, one that moved in whispers and ideology rather than armies. The Soviet Union was now the shadow on the wall. And just as the Americans had once fooled the Germans, they intended to fool the Soviets. The lessons learned from the useless German spies, from the false messages, the double agents, the invisible theater of lies, became the blueprint for a new era. The newly formed Central Intelligence Group, soon to become the CIA, studied the FBI's wartime deception files as sacred texts. Within them were the blueprints of manipulation, the science of control. Hoover's men had proven that with enough precision, even the most disciplined intelligence system could be turned inside out. The Germans had trusted their agents too much. The Americans would never make that mistake again. And so began the construction of what some historians would later call the Empire of Mirrors. For the first time in history, deception was institutionalized, not as a tactic of war, but as a permanent instrument of policy. America had realized that truth could no longer compete with the efficiency of illusion. The same methods once used to protect the homeland would now be used to shape the world beyond its borders. But inside that transformation, something fragile was lost. The men who had spent the war manipulating German intelligence found themselves haunted by the simplicity of their earlier mission. Back then, their enemy had worn a uniform. They could justify their actions as necessary, moral, even patriotic. Now, as they forged a new kind of intelligence war, the lines blurred beyond recognition. Their weapons were no longer guns or bombs, but rumors, photographs, and stories designed to infect the human mind. Among those veterans of deception was a quiet figure named Charles Deloche, a cryptographer who had spent the war intercepting German transmissions. During the Abwehr operations, he'd watched hundreds of false messages pass through his desk, each one a small lie that bent the enemy's perception. He had believed in the mission, in the righteousness of outsmarting evil. But when the war ended, he began to question what he'd become. He once wrote in his diary, "We used to lie to save lives. Now we lie to keep the peace. I wonder how long before peace becomes just another lie." His words never reached the public. They were buried in the archives, sealed under confidential, psychological operations. Meanwhile, in Europe, the fragments of the defeated German intelligence system were being quietly absorbed into the machinery of the New World. The Americans and the British, eager to gain any advantage against the Soviets, began recruiting former Abwehr and Gestapo officers. The justification was simple. These men knew the Soviet methods, the terrain, the psychology of totalitarian control. Operation Paperclip would bring scientists and engineers to the U.S., but there was a darker parallel in the intelligence world, an unofficial, unspoken arrangement. Former enemies were now informants. Former deceivers were now allies. It was the ultimate irony. The same system that had fooled Germany into defeat now embraced its architects in the name of victory. By 1947, the Central Intelligence Agency was born, and with it came a new creed, one that echoed the wartime philosophy of manipulation. Control perception, control reality. What had started as a desperate improvisation against Nazi spies had evolved into a permanent way of thinking. America was no longer simply gathering intelligence. It was manufacturing belief. Inside the new agency, teams of analysts and propagandists worked hand in hand. They crafted narratives to influence elections, destabilize governments, and mold the public mind. From Berlin to Rome to Athens, operations were launched not with armies but with ideas. Leaflets, broadcasts, forged letters. The same tools once used to confuse Hitler's generals were now deployed against entire populations. In a sense, the ghosts of the Abwehr lived on. Even as Germany was divided, its intelligence DNA survived. One half inherited by the Soviet-controlled East, the other quietly reconstituted under American supervision in the West. Reinhard Gehlen, a former Wehrmacht intelligence officer, became one of the most valuable assets in post-war espionage. His organization, the Gehlen Organization, provided the CIA with networks and intelligence deep inside Eastern Europe. He had once served Hitler. Now he served Washington. It was a pragmatic alliance, and a moral catastrophe. The Americans justified it as necessary. They argued that the Cold War demanded tools beyond ethics. Yet for those who remembered the useless spies, the irony was impossible to ignore. The war had begun with the Germans deceiving America, and ended with America learning to deceive the world. In the small town of Allendorf, a former German radio operator named Erich Gimpel, one of the last Nazi spies captured on American soil, sat in a U.S. prison cell awaiting his fate. The war was long over, but his case remained unresolved. He had expected execution, but in 1955 his sentence was commuted. He was released, a relic of a forgotten front. When asked years later if he regretted his service, he replied, "Regret? No. We all believed in something. We all sent messages we thought were true." He paused, then added, "The only difference is, they kept believing theirs." He meant the Americans. And he wasn't entirely wrong. For in the years that followed, American intelligence would master the art of self-deception. The machinery that once turned German spies into tools of falsehood was now turned inward, to justify covert actions, to conceal failures, to sustain the illusion of omniscience. The ghost of Hoover's system, efficient, bureaucratic, relentless, lived on. Files were forged. Reports were rewritten. Analysts were told what conclusions to reach before they even began. The architecture of truth had become a labyrinth of lies. But even as illusion consumed the system, it worked. The Soviet Union was contained. The West rebuilt. Democracy appeared to triumph. And yet, somewhere beneath that triumph, an unspoken unease began to grow, the sense that something essential had been lost in the process. Perhaps George had seen it coming. Before his death in 1992, he wrote a final letter to an American historian researching Operation Pastorius. In it he said, "History will remember me as a traitor. But if betrayal means refusing to live by lies, then I accept it. Because I have seen what happens when nations make lies their only language." His handwriting was fragile, his sentences uncertain, but the meaning was clear, a confession not of guilt but of clarity. For all the triumph of American counterintelligence, for all the brilliance of its deception, the legacy it left behind was double-edged. The Germans had been outwitted, yes, but the Americans had inherited their reflection. As the Cold War deepened, Washington and Moscow became mirror images of each other. Each convinced of its righteousness, each feeding its people versions of reality curated for control. The world entered an age of perpetual suspicion, where truth became just another strategic asset to be deployed or denied. In that world, the lessons of the useless German spies were not forgotten, they were perfected. And yet, somewhere deep in the archives, beneath the dust and the red stamps of secrecy, the original case files still whisper another story. A story of men who believed they were serving their country, who died without knowing that their courage had been twisted into lies. A story of intelligence officers who thought they were protecting freedom, only to discover they were protecting illusions. That story, silent and unseen, remains the true inheritance of the war. Because deception, once born, never dies. It simply changes masters. And by the late 1940s, those masters were American. By 1948, the quiet offices of wartime deception had transformed into the command centers of a new global intelligence order. Files stamped top secret, now crossed desks faster than weapons ever could. America's intelligence apparatus, born from fear of infiltration, had become a machine of manipulation, one that no longer distinguished between protecting the truth and manufacturing it. In the aftermath of victory, the illusion had grown too powerful to resist. The very act of deception that had blinded the Germans was now institutionalized as doctrine. Intelligence was no longer about knowing what was real, it was about ensuring the right people believed what was useful. The ghosts of the Abwehr, the failed agents, the intercepted messages, the false reports, had become blueprints for a new empire of control. Every lie sent across the Atlantic during the war was now studied as a model, a formula for how information could shape nations. And as the Cold War hardened, the formula spread like wildfire. The Central Intelligence Agency began funding newspapers, radio stations, and entire political movements abroad. American agents learned to speak not only in code, but in suggestion, rumor, and myth. Elections were influenced without ballots. Coups were prepared not with tanks but with whispers. The brilliance of wartime deception had evolved into the machinery of global persuasion. In the dim offices of Langley, Virginia, the veterans of the FBI's wartime operations, men who once turned German spies into pawns, now trained a new generation of operatives. Their language was colder, their logic mechanical. Words like perception management, psychological leverage, and narrative dominance became part of everyday planning. To them, the war had proven something profound. Truth was pliable. It could be bent, reshaped, or replaced, and the world would move on as long as the illusion felt real. It was a dangerous revelation, one that transformed espionage from a craft of defense into an instrument of empire. Across the Atlantic, in ruined European cities still covered in dust, this new kind of warfare quietly unfolded. Germany, now divided, became the testing ground. West Berlin was the front line of a silent contest where stories mattered more than bullets. The CIA and the newly formed KGB each built their own invisible armies, not of soldiers but of informants, journalists, priests, and professors. The battle wasn't for territory but for minds. And in that new war, the techniques of the past came roaring back. Fake defectors, controlled leaks, staged betrayals. Everything that had fooled the Abwehr was now being turned against Moscow, and against anyone who questioned the narrative of freedom. It was a victory that looked like truth and a truth that felt like victory. But not everyone was convinced. Among the early officers of the CIA was a man named Thomas Bradshaw, a former interrogator who had worked under Hoover during the German spy cases. In 1950, after witnessing a covert operation in Eastern Europe, he resigned abruptly, leaving behind a letter that was never meant to be read publicly. He wrote, "We have become the enemy's reflection. They used fear to control minds. We use hope. They used lies to protect tyranny. We use lies to defend freedom. The method is the same. Only the slogan is different." His letter was buried in agency archives, labeled Psych Evaluation. But in the years that followed, Bradshaw's words became prophecy. As America's influence spread, the illusion it had built began to turn inward. Intelligence reports were edited to justify policies already decided. Misinformation, once a weapon against the enemy, became a shield for power itself. The architects of deception had created a world where the truth could no longer be separated from its reflection. And beneath the triumph of modern espionage, an uncomfortable question lingered. Had the United States truly defeated the ideology of its enemies, or had it simply perfected their tools? The irony was inescapable. The Germans had entered the war believing that control over information meant control over destiny. They believed their agents abroad could bend the truth of nations to their will. In the end, it was America that inherited that power, and with it, the same moral corrosion that had once destroyed its enemies. Meanwhile, in post-war Germany, the last surviving spies of the Third Reich lived quiet, fractured lives. Men like William Colpaw, once trained to sabotage America's factories, found themselves free after years in prison, wandering through a country that no longer remembered them. He gave one interview decades later, saying softly, "The war we lost wasn't against America. It was against reality. We thought we could invent it. But they learned to do it better." In that single sentence lay the tragedy of two nations bound by the same illusion. By the 1960s, the machinery of deception had evolved beyond anything the wartime agents could have imagined. Satellites watched the skies. Propaganda shaped the news. Television became the new battlefield, and the line between fact and fabrication faded beneath static and screen light. What began as coded messages sent from Lisbon to Berlin had grown into a global theater where every citizen played a role, knowingly or not, in the story their governments told them. The useless German spies, long forgotten, had become a metaphor, not for failure but for inevitability. They had believed lies because they wanted to believe. So did everyone else. And in that way their legacy endured. In 1963, a small box of documents was declassified briefly before being resealed. Inside were transcripts of German messages intercepted by the FBI during the war, with marginal notes written by agents in pencil. One line, faint but legible, read, "The truth is what survives deception." But history would prove otherwise. Truth didn't survive deception. It adapted to it. It evolved until the difference between the two no longer mattered. By the time the Cold War reached its fevered peak, the original architects of American counterintelligence were dead or forgotten. Their lessons lived on, buried inside institutions that had outgrown their creators. The deception that once fooled Berlin now encircled the globe. Nations spied on allies, Allies deceived their own people, and ordinary citizens learned to doubt everything, every broadcast, every headline, every silence. And in that growing uncertainty, power found its sanctuary. Because a world that doubts everything will believe anything. That was the ultimate triumph of deception, and the quiet curse left behind by those useless German spies who had never known what they had started. They had shown America that lies could win wars. And America never stopped winning them. By the time the Berlin Wall rose in 1961, the world had completed its transformation into a hall of mirrors. The war of shadows that began with 8 German saboteurs stepping onto an American beach had become a permanent condition of human civilization. There were no longer clear lines between truth and fiction, no longer enemies and allies, only narratives competing for dominance. In Washington, the old veterans of counterintelligence, those who had once outwitted the Abwehr, watched this transformation with a strange mix of pride and dread. They had won a war, but what had they created? They looked at the agencies they helped build, the CIA, the NSA, the vast architecture of secrecy, and saw reflections of the same arrogance that had doomed their adversaries in 1942. The illusion of control. The belief that truth could be engineered without consequence. And yet, the machinery kept turning. By the 1970s, the files of wartime deception had become relics. Operation Pastorius, the Abwehr failures, the double agents who never knew they'd been betrayed, all were footnotes in the vast, growing library of espionage history. The names were forgotten, but the methods lived on, replicated in countless operations around the globe. In Vietnam, deception shaped entire campaigns. In Latin America, it propped up governments and destroyed others. The techniques perfected against the Germans, disinformation, infiltration, the creation of controlled opposition, became the language of global politics. What had once been exceptional was now routine. But something else was happening, something no intelligence officer had predicted. The lies had begun to consume the liars. The people who built the illusion no longer knew where it ended. Information moved too fast, too far. A story whispered in a briefing room could become public knowledge in hours. A rumor planted abroad could return home as truth. The empire of mirrors had grown so vast that even its architects could no longer see where the reflections met reality. In the aftermath of Watergate, when Americans learned that their own government had been deceiving them, the shock felt almost familiar, as though the entire nation had finally discovered it had been living in one of its own illusions. The outrage was real, but so was the resignation. Perhaps deep down they already knew. After all, it had been deception, clever, patriotic, meticulously constructed, that had saved America in its darkest hour. The culture of secrecy had begun as protection. It had simply never ended. And in that continuity, the legacy of the useless German spies endured. They had believed in an empire of lies and paid the price. The Americans had believed they could master lies without becoming them. History proved them both wrong. George died alone in Germany, uncelebrated and unwanted. His story, once buried under classified stamps, resurfaced only in fragments. A newspaper in the 1980s ran a small feature calling him the spy who saved America. But even that was an illusion. He hadn't saved America. He had revealed it to itself. His betrayal had forced the United States to confront the fragility of its innocence. He had shown them that trust could kill, and that deception, if used correctly, could protect. The lesson was learned too well. In the decades that followed, that same logic justified wars fought in the name of invisible threats, surveillance conducted in the name of freedom, and entire populations guided by information crafted for effect rather than truth. By the end of the 20th century, the machinery of deception had become indistinguishable from the machinery of governance. Every nation, not just America, had adopted the same methods. The entire world had become an intelligence operation, an endless cycle of information, manipulation, and belief. And yet, through all of it, the same old ghosts remained. The Abwehr agents who once believed they were heroes. The FBI operatives who forged their words into weapons. The analysts who learned to lie for peace. The politicians who discovered that lies outlive laws. They are all part of the same story, the story of how a handful of captured German spies taught the most powerful nation on earth that truth was not a weapon but a weakness. It was not hatred that destroyed them, nor bullets, nor betrayal. It was certainty. The certainty that they were right, that they controlled the game, that they understood reality. In the end, they were all deceived. The Germans, the Americans, the entire generation that believed wars could be won with lies. Because lies do not end when the war ends. They survive. They adapt. They become culture. And so, in a quiet symmetry that history rarely allows, the United States inherited the very flaw it had once exploited in its enemy, the illusion of absolute control. When the Berlin Wall finally fell in 1989, a few aging intelligence officers stood among the crowds, anonymous and unrecognized. They watched the wall crumble, the cheers rising through the cold air, the flags waving in the light of freedom. To the world it was the end of an era. To them it was a déjà vu, the same illusion reborn under new names. Freedom built on secrecy. Truth built on convenience. Victory built on deception. And somewhere in that celebration, perhaps in the silence between the chants, one could almost hear the echo of that first message from Lisbon decades earlier, a message meant for Berlin written in Washington. A lie that had won a war. A whisper that had outlived every empire it touched. History rarely remembers the names of spies, especially the ones who fail. But failure, in their world, is only another kind of success. Success for someone else in another room reading another report. That is the cruel poetry of espionage. No truth survives intact and no lie dies completely. They merge, they blend, they become the narrative we call history. And so, the story of the useless German spies ends as it began, not with an explosion but with a silence that still shapes the world. Because in the end, the greatest deception was never the one America played on Germany. It was the one it played on itself. The belief that lies, once justified by victory, could remain harmless. That truth could be controlled. That illusion could be mastered. It never could. The war of shadows never ended. It only changed its language, its uniforms, its borders. And somewhere, in every coded message, every headline, every convenient truth we choose to believe, the ghosts of those spies are still speaking, reminding us that power built on deception always decays from within. And when the last lie finally collapses under its own weight, what remains is silence. A silence that sounds eerily like the truth,